the course on ag land preservation. But in my pocket I have a clock, so we'll try to keep it to 45 or 50 minutes tonight. I've got a lot of things to tell you, and I don't have all that much time. And I do want to give you some background on this issue. It's not as simple as it sounds. It's certainly not as simple as I thought it was when I first got involved with the issue of farmland protection some 12 years or so ago at this point. I want to give you a little historical perspective, but first of all I want to frame this issue of farming on the fringe. I threw together a few overheads this afternoon. I got one F in school in my entire life, from kindergarten through graduate school, and I had been in college for about 2 weeks, and we had a guest lecturer, a political scientist named Martin Diamond, who came to speak to us at Northern Illinois. And Mr. Diamond didn't use any overheads. He talked about things that I didn't understand, and the next day we got a test on everything that I didn't pay attention to the night before. And that's the only time that ever happened. So I decided not to do that to any of you tonight. This presentation was billed as farming on the fringe. And that's important because agriculture is by far and away the biggest industry in this country. About a quarter of all the jobs in the country are related to agriculture. The gross product is somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 billion a year. You can probably multiply that by about 4 times. The distinctive difference between agriculture and other industries is that it relies on the land. The funny thing about the land in this country is that as many people want to look at it as a commodity, as something only to be bought and traded and sold and built on and used, as they do want to look at it as a resource. And it really needs to be looked at as a resource as well. I'll put this in context for you so that you get a feel for what we're talking about when I talk about farming on the fringe and the need to protect the best agricultural land. About a fourth of all the jobs in this country are directly related to food production, processing, distribution, somehow tied to the agriculture industry. Now, one of the things that I'm told oftentimes is, why on earth are you concerned about that land? I've flown from New York to California or Chicago to California. I look out the window and it looks like there's nothing down there, and that's precisely the point. Most of that land is not good land. There's about 900 million, give or take 50 million or so, acres of private open land in this country. About 400 million of that are used for cropland purposes, for cropping. In any given year, about 70 million are set aside. The Agriculture Department requires that farmers set aside about 70 million acres. That's intended to be highly erodible, marginal agricultural land. You're supposed to focus your production on the best ground. We've got about 40 million acres in the Conservation Reserve at this point in time. Curiously enough, of that 400 million acres, about 100 or 110 million are so erodible that they really don't belong in row crop production. They should be in some kind of permanent vegetative cover. The environmental hazards of soil erosion on that land, the costs of managing it so that you don't cause water quality problems, are much greater than the value of the products that you can get from them, at least when you're row cropping. That brings us down to about 290 million acres of high-quality cropland in this country. And I just saw a couple of weeks ago, the Commerce Department has revised the 90 census numbers to about 260 million people in this country. So we're in the ballpark of an acre of good land per person in this country right now. Loss rates somewhere sustained since the end of World War II on the order of about 1.5 million acres a year of cropland taken permanently out of production, paved over for urban uses, interstate highway system, going into public uses for parks, waterways, reservoirs, a whole range of things, but taken out of the private sector and made unavailable permanently for agricultural use. Probably on the order of 45 million or so acres in the last 45 or 50 years, maybe somewhat more than that. But here's the most important thing that we have to grapple with. In 1985, we took, the American Farmland Trust took the top 20% of farming counties in every state in the nation, and then correlated those with metropolitan statistical areas. 58%, roughly 6 out of 10 of the most productive farming counties in the country, were in or adjacent to metropolitan statistical areas. 5 years later, we did that with 90 population census information and 87 census of agriculture information. That's up to 67%. On the order of 7 out of 10 of the country's most productive farming counties are inside metropolitan statistical areas. What does that mean? It means something very simple. Good land is good for everything. What are we seeing? We're seeing the play out of settlement patterns in this country over the last couple hundred years. If you look at the way these things aggregate, the eastern half of the country, you'll see, in fact, we've mapped this out. It's not on a scale that you would have been able to see here tonight. But what we've done is map out metropolitan statistical areas and then shade the high-value agricultural counties, and they all aggregate around metropolitan statistical areas. In the eastern half of the country, the MSAs correlate with waterways. They're either on seaports, lake ports, rivers, or along the old canal system. And as soon as you move into the western half of the country, they correlate with the Transcontinental Railroad. And basically what you had happen, these were all essentially agrarian settlements early on. So the people, as they moved west, up to about the Mississippi, found good valleys on the Ohio River system, the Mississippi River system, along the canals, on the Great Lakes. And if you look up and down the East Coast, you'll find places like New York and Baltimore and Boston all correlate with natural harbors. And as soon as you get into the Great Plains and the far west, you see the exact same pattern emerge along the major rail lines. Those also were agricultural settlements in the first place, and they're all surrounded by the best land. So where do we find ourselves at the end of the 20th century? And that's in direct competition with each other. Nobody, I think, is suggesting that we can afford not to eat. The one industry that we've got a clear competitive advantage over everybody else in the world is agriculture, both from a land quality standpoint and a technological standpoint. And it's something that, at least on its face, can't be exported or given away. The land really is ours. I also like to point out that it's the one industry, since I've been involved in this business, I've had pointed out to me that the tax system does a lot of things, and one of the things it does for other capital goods and other industries is provide for accelerated depreciation schedules. This is the one input in the one industry that if you take good care of it, it doesn't only not depreciate, you can actually make it better. I like to talk about accelerated appreciation schedules if we do all this right. Now, how did we get here? We didn't suddenly get a concern. In fact, I'm going to give you a little historical perspective now on agricultural preservation in this country, but when I first went to work at the Illinois Department of Agriculture, I had to prepare a speech for my division manager. And we were being criticized by an economist at the University of Illinois named Julian Simon, who said this is just the issue of the moment, and it's a front for aesthetes and elitists on the East Coast who just want to preserve open space in most of the country for their own pleasure. We had a little Catholic college in Springfield, Illinois called Springfield College, of all things. And they had a library with some old books in it. I found one, and in there I found a speech by a guy named Marcus Publius Varro. His speech was made in 79 AD, and Varro happens to be a consular official in Rome, addressing the Senate of Rome. And he gets up and says, you know, senators, we're getting so spread out around Rome. We've got soil erosion on the hills. Agricultural production is so far outside the city limits that if we're not careful, we're going to be attacked by somebody who can cut us off from our agricultural land, and Rome is going to fall. And some of that actually came true. So at least for the last 1910 years or so, this problem has been perceived by some people. But how did we get here in this country? Take it back to 1969 and the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. NEPA didn't deal explicitly with farmland. It dealt with noise and air and water quality, wildlife habitats, wetlands, scenic values, virtually everything but prime agricultural lands. And what it required that you do is lay out a series of alternatives. When you're involved in a public capital development, a public project, you had to look at different options for doing the same thing that minimize the threat to a range of environmental values. The effect of that in many cases, particularly with highways, with the placement of certain public buildings, housing projects, was literally to direct them onto the best agricultural land. It tended not to have species. It was developed for agriculture at that point. It tended not to have a lot of the other environmental values that we were most concerned about at that point in time. So literally, you began to direct these major projects onto agricultural land. Subsequently, that got amended. We'll get down there in a minute. 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed. And in 72, the Clean Water Act focused mostly on point sources of pollution. And we'll get back to there in 1977. But most importantly, President Nixon, for those of you who remember, went to China and went to the Soviet Union in 1972, established trade ties with both of those nations again. And in 1973, his Secretary of Agriculture, a fellow named Earl Butz, made a speech and told farmers to begin to produce from the middle of the road to the middle of the road, from fence row to fence row. Put every arable acre that you could get your hands on into production. That did a couple of things. Number one, it literally wiped out land that had been in conservation uses for 30 and 40 years since the Dust Bowl. Fence rows came down, trees came down, woodlands came down. The soil erosion problem in this country magnified greatly. But the big problem from a land use standpoint was that it gave us the illusion between 1974 and 1978, roughly 70 to 90 million acres of land came into production that had not been in production before. It had the effect of expanding the cropland base and making it look like not only was there no problem with land loss, but that in fact we had more land than we possibly knew what to do with. What we didn't recognize at that point was the environmental costs of bringing that highly erodible land into production. We began to by 1977. We got a control over some point sources of pollution in those 5 years, and the Clean Water Act was amended in 1977 to focus on non-point sources. What that meant for the most part was soil erosion. That's the biggest non-point source of water pollution in this country. The 1980, President Carter authorized a National Agricultural Land Study. It was a major research effort. What we identified was, based on an inventory done in 1978, was that between 1967 and 1977, that 10-year period, roughly 30 million acres of agricultural land had been developed into urban and built-up uses in this country. That was a period of high economic activity. I'm not suggesting that we've been losing 3 million acres a year forever, but it's on the order of 1.5 million acres since the early 1950s. But in that period, almost 30 million acres of land went permanently out of production. The point that I want to make is that it was masked. Remember what I said, the trend that we've been watching emerge, 6 out of 10, now 7 out of 10 of our most productive counties remaining are inside or adjacent to metropolitan statistical areas. So while we're paving over the best land, the most environmentally safe land that we've got, we're bringing into production more and more highly erodible land, lowering water quality, and raising the cost of production. To make that land produce, you've got to use more purchase inputs, more fertilizer. In parts of the country, you've got insect problems, weed problems. The cost of production to the farmer is higher, and the cost to the public is higher in terms of environmental damages that's caused by producing on that land. So we're sort of nibbling on ourselves at both ends, paving over our best land and allowing ourselves to think that we don't have a problem because we're bringing poor quality land into production. Things started to change in 1981, and in part because of the establishment of the American Farmland Trust, which happened in 1980. In response to the findings of the Farmland Protection Policy Act. In addition to identifying this 3 million acre loss, what we did is identify about 250 local programs that were trying to deal with it, and about 20 or 30 states at that point had tried to come to grips with this land loss problem. In 1981, the federal government passed the Farmland Protection Policy Act. Essentially what it says is that the federal government will respect the terms of state and local farmland preservation programs. If you're trying to do something to manage your land in Indiana, in Illinois, the federal government won't undercut your efforts. You don't want a federal housing project on farmland because you have a farmland preservation program. They won't put it there. The burden of the action is on the state and the local government. 1985, the Food Security Act was passed. Now we start to get into some very, very meaty issues. And I don't know if there's any public affairs, public policy, or political science students in here, but here's where we begin to link farmland protection, conservation, and farm policy itself. Farm programs in this country, since they have been instituted, have been essentially income enhancement programs for farmers. They began in the Depression the first time around. We've sort of lost the reason why they first came into place. But what they have done is reward output at all costs. You get a minimum price for your product, then you get a deficiency payment. So if the market price for corn is below what it costs you to produce it, the government pays you the difference between your cost of production and the market price for corn. The way you maximize your income as a farm program farmer in this country is to maximize your output. There's no consequence at all for that. So that to the extent that you're using highly erodible land, to the extent that you're farming right up to the riverbank, that you've taken out wildlife habitat and woodlands to produce commodities, you get a greater benefit. There was no linkage whatsoever. In 1985, we created a concept called conservation compliance. What it said is that by 1995, you have to have a conservation plan on your land that can't be farmed, that erodes so heavily that it can't be cropped without causing water problems, habitat problems, has to come out of production. The buzzword for that is decoupling. We're breaking the link between public benefits and the farm programs and output at any cost, and linking up to a standard of care and stewardship for the land. Okay, 1990, Food, Agriculture, Conservation, and Trade Act. We've taken a step farther. In 85, we established a conservation reserve, a soil conservation reserve, to enroll these highly erodible lands. In 1990, we took it a step farther. We now have a wetlands reserve. We have a forest legacy program, a method to reestablish forests on highly erodible lands. And we've got a concept that emerged. A good friend of mine from the University of Illinois, who's now at the University of Minnesota, and I have stayed close over the years, a woman named Joan Nassauer. When I was in Illinois, she asked me to come over and judge a series of projects that were being done by her MLA students. And what they had begun to do is design rural landscapes and incorporate approved soil conservation practices into these landscape designs. What she was looking at was the cornfields of central Illinois that when I started college had gone from windbreaks around every farmstead, woodlots with animals in the fields, fences around the fields. There was an aesthetic value when you went through the countryside 25 years ago. In response to this call in the mid-70s to tear all of that out, produce as much as you can, and we'll export it to the Soviet Union and China and everywhere else that wanted to buy it, and we'll make so much money that we'll be able to take care of all of our problems. All of that went away. So that by the time you get to the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the countryside in most of the United States is just a flat expanse with a white house here or there. The soil is eroding. Crop prices are down. You've got a true depression in rural areas. What Joan had begun to recognize, and we were already working on this concept of compliance, and you can actually integrate design standards into the conservation practices. And if we're successful, well, this is 1980, and these students are already working on this. In 1985, we got this notion of conservation compliance. The message now is that you can literally begin to build soil conservation back into the rural landscape in a way that's aesthetically pleasing. Now, in land conservation in general, what I see emerging is a real comprehensive view. If you go back 10 years ago, you had the Nature Conservancy working on habitats and endangered species and wetlands to some extent. You had people involved in parks and conservation doing their own thing. American Farmland Trust, when it was first organized, operated somewhat of a vacuum. Now, what you see emerging is essentially a notion of nodes and corridors. Preserved battlefields, parks, habitats, wetlands. The Nature Conservancy now has a concept they call biodiversity. They're working on bioreserves. We're working on major agricultural reserves in a dozen or so eastern states, and we're moving west. A lot of these being linked up with rails, trails corridors, hiking trails, greenways along major highways, along riparian corridors, along rivers and streams. There's a real convergence in the land conservation arena. And a large part of it goes right into agriculture. I got the sentence for you out of the 1990 Food, Agriculture, Conservation, and Trade Act, the Farm Bill of last year. It says conservation systems can add significantly to the aesthetic values of agricultural land. Conservation plans and systems implemented under the conservation programs of the Department of Agriculture should attempt to demonstrate the beauty of good stewardship and improve the aesthetic appearance of rural landscapes. I can't tell you how hard we had to fight to get that statement, to get Congress to include that. By the same token, I can't tell you what kind of standing that has given what we do inside of ASLA, inside of graduate schools, and I think inside of planning schools now, where we're beginning to recognize this notion isn't going away anymore. The idea that you can do anything that you want on land just because you own it at the expense of the environment is gone for practical purposes. There's a tremendous disincentive now. The federal farm program pays $30 billion a year to landowners, direct payments to landowners. All of that now is linked to how you care for the land. If I'm in a county planning department or a planning consulting firm, I am in a position now, I've got the big stick over these farmers. I can go back into my road corridors. I can sow down the roadsides. I've got something to take to them through the Soil Conservation Services Technical Assistance Program, and you're going to begin to see very shortly, I think we'll have time to throw up a few slides. Some of them are simulations, some of them are actual pictures of conservation farms. You can get the kind of technical assistance to literally rebuild a conservation landscape in the country. Now what's going on out there in farmland protection? We've got three things, three levels. I mentioned to you the Farmland Protection Policy Act at the federal level. The feds have basically said it's not our problem, it's yours. States, you deal with it. You decide how your local governments and your communities, what kind of opportunities they're going to have to plan and manage their land. You got to put the same kind of restrictions on state capital development projects that the federal government's willing to put on theirs. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Highways. It's always been assumed that if you've got an old road that was built in the 1930s, the lanes are narrow, the shoulders are soft, that the way you do that, replace that facility, is to go 5 or 10 miles east or west, line up 4 or 5 road corridors and build a freeway. What we were able to show highway engineers in Illinois, and it's been done elsewhere in the country now, is that you can build, particularly through rural areas. Traffic volumes aren't that great. You can build 2 new lanes next to the existing 2 to 1990 standards, open those, and then fall back on the old 2 and rebuild those. We did a 40-mile segment in the early 1980s of US 51 through central Illinois before I left. At 40 miles, we saved over 20,000 acres of land and roughly $20 million in land acquisition fees that didn't have to be spent. And more importantly, instead of having a new road corridor 10 miles outside of all the towns, we brought the rural towns into the planning process. And we asked them, where do you want your bypasses? One town said, we don't want a bypass. 51 went right through downtown. They said, bring it right through downtown. The farthest out, the design standard, the Illinois Department of Transportation was to put a bypass 1.5 miles outside the city limits. There wasn't one small town that wanted that bypass more than 0.5 mile outside the city limits, and most of them wanted it 1/4 mile outside the city limits. They knew the effect of a road corridor like that, 1.5 miles, that it would suck the life out of the rural Main Street. Nobody had ever asked them before, where would you like this facility to go? Airports. You get a rural or a regional airport design. Inevitably, the local authority takes 2 and 3 times as much land as they need to put runways in, control facilities, and then ultimately this functions like a local chamber of commerce. They broker this land off to warehouse owners and hoteliers and all kinds of economic development. The reason they say they have to take so much land in the first place is to protect clear airspace. Well, you can do that with conservation easements. You don't have to take the land outright. Corn plants don't grow so high that they interfere with aircraft taking off and landing. Began to do that kind of restriction on state capital development projects. You can do it with an executive order first. You don't have to have legislation. Legislation is expensive, it takes a long time, and sometimes it's politically tough to do. In states with strong governors, you can pass an executive order. The governor controls the executive agencies. You can enforce these policies onto the executive branch. Once it's seen that it's not a draconian measure, you're not trying to stop the legitimate business of government, you can go back and legislate them. Here's what I started to talk about. You've got to have some kind of policy to integrate a whole range of land conservation programs. These things don't operate. Historic preservation, recreation, agricultural land protection don't operate outside the context. Remember what I said before. What we're concerned about is good land. Protecting, managing, and using good land, which really is a scarce resource, the best way we possibly can. So what you need to do is understand that in many ways, a good, well-designed agricultural landscape provides a recreational opportunity. The second most popular form of recreation in this country is driving for pleasure. People get outside of an urban area on the way to a park, and if the countryside looks good, people feel good. They begin to enjoy that right away. So you need to integrate policies in land and water conservation, open space, recreation, habitat, all of those have to have some kind of theme that literally forces these agencies. Bureaucrats won't get together unless they're forced to by some kind of public policy. Some form of property tax relief. Agricultural land does not use any public services. The way development is often sold to local governments is that it's going to improve the tax base. Let me take this acre of farmland that's only generating $100 an acre a year in taxes and put a house on there and it'll pay $1,500 an acre a year. It also imposes $3,000 worth of public service costs on the local government, and nobody sees that for a few years. So it's an equitable measure that agricultural land be taxed more in line with its use value than with its market value. And that's just fair. In any event, our studies have shown that agricultural land only gets between 11 cents and 18 cents worth of public services for every dollar in tax revenue that it generates. A non-farm residence tends to get somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.28 to $1.35 in services for every dollar of tax revenue. There's a subsidy that goes on from private open lands to underwrite the cost of public services. In most states, the authority to plan and zone comes from the state government down to the local government. You've got to have some flexible enabling authority. You can't dictate the conditions from the state capital that local governments have to live with, or they won't implement it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Oregon's land use planning program. It's always touted as the best in the nation. Oregon came up with a set of 19 criteria. Every county had to develop a comprehensive plan. They had to have certain kind of zones. They were of certain sizes and certain uses. Oregon just studied the enforcement, the implementation of this program after 10 years. Roughly 1 request for a rezoning and 2 is granted in the exclusive farm use zone. The reason is that the state policy was so inflexible that most local governments aren't willing to enforce it. So unless you allow it to be crafted in some measure at the local level, let people buy into it and gain some ownership of the local land use plan and ordinance, they're not going to enforce it, they're not going to implement it. We talked about the economics of agriculture a little bit. It's the biggest industry in the country. In most of our states, agriculture is the biggest industry. You get a tremendous multiplier effect from agricultural production. I don't know if you're familiar with how much some of the states have paid recently. Illinois has a Chrysler-Mitsubishi plant, Diamond Star Auto plant in Bloomington, Illinois. It cost Illinois $150 million to land that plant. They were in competition with about 6 other states. Their own analysis showed that after 20 years, they expected to net about $150 million in revenue from that plant. Kentucky's got a Toyota plant in Georgetown. It cost them about $200 million. No coincidence that they estimate they'll get roughly $200 million in public revenue back over the economic life of that factory. They're basically washouts. What it costs you to get one is about what you can expect to get back over the life of some of these economic developments. The point there is that everybody gains from agriculture. It's an industry that can be sustained, can operate in an environmentally sound way. It provides jobs, it provides economic opportunity, and local governments can't afford to can bear all of the expense of preservation themselves. You need some kind of a cost-sharing program as well. And then remember, agriculture is an economic use. Just because we preserve the land, and you can't walk away and assume that industry is going to be able to continue economically. The state's got to provide some kind of product development assistance, some kind of marketing assistance, and some kind of promotional programs. It doesn't just happen by itself. And farmers can't do it all. Our experience is that they're more than willing to use preservation programs where they've got an option, but they're not market development specialists. They can't do it all. They've got to have some assistance with this one. Now locally, successful farmland preservation programs ultimately go into effect at the local level. My pet phrase for that is particular places. We don't really live in the United States. We don't really live in our individual state. We live in a neighborhood. We live in particular places, and that's what we identify with. That's where these things work well. Locally, preservation programs don't work out of a comprehensive context as well. You've got to have either a land use plan or a comprehensive plan. You've got to have strong policy statements. To make them legally enforceable, you've got to have clear, strong policy statements regarding the need to manage and protect agricultural lands. If possible, your plan ought to have a separate agricultural element. You've got to have a zoning ordinance to implement the plan, and that's very simple, basic land use stuff. The plan is your policy document that expresses your values. The zoning ordinance is how you put them into effect. It's just that simple. So you can't make your plan come alive without a land use or zoning ordinance. If you're talking about farmland protection, if you can get away with it politically, the best way to go is an exclusive farm use zone. Got nothing to do with lot sizes or anything else. What you do in that zone is agriculture. You don't put gravel quarries next to elementary schools, and you don't put nuclear waste dumps next to playgrounds. Certain land uses are just incompatible. And to the extent that you can get away with it, an ag use zone is an industrial zone all by itself. Ag districts, about 20 states now use some kind of an agricultural district. It's a voluntary agreement between the landowner and the county or the state where they agree to keep their land open and agricultural. They get protections from nuisance suits, protection from ad valorem levies and special assessments, and usually some protection from eminent domain actions, taking actions by the government. Oftentimes they lead into permanent programs, what we call compensatory programs. Purchase of development rights, transfer of development rights, conservation easement programs. In most of the states that have these programs, where you're literally talking about purchasing a conservation interest in the land, putting a restrictive easement over the land in perpetuity in most cases. You get into an agricultural district first, that qualifies you to sell an easement to the local government ultimately. The PDR and TDR programs, if you're going to talk about permanent preservation, you've got to provide some kind of compensation. Planning and zoning are management level activities. They're not forever. To give you a feel for what's happened, in 1980 there were about 1,000 acres of farmland under purchased easement in this country. Last week there were about 300,000 acres. In 10 years, 11 years, these programs have gone from roughly 1,000 acres to 300,000 acres, from about $1.5 million to about $800 million in the pipeline. These are all state and local programs. We've surveyed all the farmers in Massachusetts and Connecticut, about 400 farmers that have gone through these programs. 90% of them would do it again. They're recognizing that it's a way for young farmers to enter the industry. New farmers don't have to buy development value in land that they don't want to use, and that's the only way that you bring new people into an industry with very, very high entry costs. The other thing that 9 out of 10 people said is that this program ought to be offered as a national option. They're incredibly popular. The way I read that in states, particularly in the Midwest, where we don't have these programs available yet, and people sometimes wonder if they would work, it took a little while for them to get entrenched in the states where they are in place as well. But they're wildly popular. They work. They work from a fiscal standpoint. They work from an economic standpoint. They're popular. They're well worth doing. And I think that the one thing that well, they work from an environmental standpoint anymore as well. And the one thing that I've stopped apologizing for, I went out east feeling that I had to defend myself against these economists that accuse this of being nothing but an aesthetic open space program, of having no basis in economics, no fiscal sense. I think we've made those arguments well, and I don't apologize for the aesthetic values of agricultural land anymore. They're there, and they ought to be enjoyed. They can continue to be enjoyed, and we can get a whole range of environmental values out of them. I want to leave some time for questions, but I've got a couple of pictures here that I want to show you. A couple of the way things used to be. And I've got, I think, an Illinois farm, a Minnesota farm, and a Wisconsin farm. And then I've got about 2 sets of 3 or 4 computer-generated images that go from a typical cornfield into successively more managed landscapes. And I think for those of you that appreciate the design principles, you'll see some of the precepts of this concept of aesthetic conservation here. Can we have the lights? There we go. That's 1975, I guess. And that's where we were. Look at the water used to run like chocolate milk, literally. You can see the eroded hillsides in the foreground there. That's either overgrazed or if it's got row crops on it, I can't tell. But that's where we were. And here's where we want to go. This is Wisconsin, I believe. That's a stream corridor in Illinois. And notice how you've got a riparian corridor developing here. You go back 10 years ago and that would have been corn, literally up to the water's edge. But that's a small stream corridor in Illinois right now, fairly recent picture. That's Minnesota, contour strip cropping in Minnesota. And now I've got a series of, these are all, I believe all, computer-generated images here. You'll see right in the middle of this one, there's actually a stream corridor that runs through the middle of this photo. I think that's a cornfield. The same stream corridor runs right about through the middle here. It's been replaced with all corn. You've got a series of grasses and forbs that have been put into the middle of this image. Here you can see it a little bit better again. There's the stream corridor again. You notice you're getting some relief out on the horizon out there. Now you're building a riparian corridor across this stream bed through the cornfield. And there you've introduced a series of natural forbs and wildflowers in the foreground. You've got your row crops in there, and you also notice that you've added a fence in the background now. Fences, whitewashing, proper care of buildings and fences tend to be the epitome. There's a lot of research, survey research, been done on what standards of care, what suggests itself to people, a well-managed, caring landscape, and strangely enough, fences and well-cared-for buildings, freshly painted buildings, connote a high degree of care. Now here's a stream corridor that is probably overgrazed. There's probably been animals in there to cause that kind of stream bank erosion. But what we're going to do is work on this corridor itself. There you can see it's been sown down. Now you've added some visual relief off to the side here. You've got some shrubs and trees been planted. And I think the last one in then is the final step where you actually do have fences introduced again. All of these, every one of these images is using practices. That's it. You could bring the lights back up now. Every one of these images is using soil conservation practices that are approved by the Soil Conservation Service, for which cost sharing is available, that work inside of a conservation plan, that I hope suggests some standard of care, aesthetic value on the rural landscape, and that dovetail with these emerging farmland preservation programs out there. I really do think it's beginning to hang together for us. That's mostly what I wanted to tell you. If anybody's got specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them for a while. Yes, sir. Right?
How long will that take?
You mean so we went from an eroded stream bank to the last image? I would take a guess and say that some of those shrubs were probably 7, 8 years old. The trees were probably 10 years old. But you can establish a ground cover within a matter of weeks. And that's essentially the way you would go at it, is in a 10-year plan. So in a scene like that, you'd go in the first year and probably put some quick-growing grasses down just to stabilize the soil. The next year, you'd probably go in with a selection of native forbs and wildflowers and probably establish some shrubs and tree plantings once you've got your corridor established, and over time, generally they are 10-year plans, and you try to implement roughly 10% a year with cost-sharing assistance of up to 75% from the federal government.
Where did the money for the development rights?
Transfer of development rights, the public cost is typically staff time. They've been counted. Transfer of development rights, I wish I had a zoning map I could show you here. Essentially what you're designing on your land use map is an area, let's say it's zoned at 1 unit per 5 acres or 1 unit per 10 acres. You're allowing the individual that owns land in that district to transfer that density, the right to build. Let's say you had 100 acres and 1 unit per 10 acres. So that person's got the right to transfer 10 development rights into an area that you've designed because it's got sewers and water and other public services. It can be developed more intensively. Excuse me. So you will allow that landowner to sell the right to build 10 homes to the landowner in the receiving area or the development area. That's principally a private transaction, except that our experience is that it doesn't happen except in communities where you've got a very, very sophisticated planning staff presence. There's only a couple of jurisdictions in the country where you've had any real meaningful TDR activity occur, and that's because you've had full-time staff assigned to it. In most cases, more than one full-time staff person, 2 and 3 and 4 planners, facilitating transactions between developers and farmer landowners, conservationists. My argument there is that's where your long-term cost is in staff. Purchase of development rights is very simple. You've designated a preservation area on the map and you appraise the land for its development value and its agricultural value, and you buy all or part of the difference. The land is worth $4,000 an acre as a house site and $2,000 an acre as farmland. You're paying somewhere between $1 and $2,000 an acre to buy a perpetual easement over that land. You literally place a deed restriction on the deed, record it, and take the development rights away. Those are done largely with public monies, and they come in general from 3 sources. Bonded debt. They pass a bond referendum and sell bonds to use as a source of funding. That's been the case in large measure. Pennsylvania has a $100 million program. Massachusetts has spent about $75 million over the last 10 years, all with bonded debt. New Jersey passed a $50 million bond referendum, and then just year before last went back with another $100 million referendum. That's been the preferred method. Second most popular method is with a portion of the real estate transfer tax, and that's the way Maryland has gone. Anybody who develops a farm in the state of Maryland pays 5% of the development value of that farm into the state's farmland preservation fund. So the motto goes something like, if you're going to develop a farm in Maryland, that's okay, but you're going to make enough funds available to preserve one as well. It's actually a little better than a one-for-one trade-off, but off of a real estate transfer tax. The third case, and it's just a couple of local programs in North Carolina, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, which is Charlotte, Wake County, which is Raleigh-Durham, and Forsyth County, North Carolina, both do it right on the budget. They have a line item in the county budget of $500,000 a year, and they line the farmers up and buy as many as they can buy for $500,000 a year, and that's the way they do it. But 3 principal sources. There's general revenues, real estate transfer taxes, and bonded debt.
What's the reason that there hasn't been as much information that can run so that there is prices or there's perception that the amount of farmland that can have is still relatively boundless?
It's not relatively boundless. That was one of those questions I was going to write on a 3x5 card and make sure somebody asked me, because I come from Chicago and Illinois, and I think we had as big a problem there as they do anywhere in the country. And I went out to the East Coast, and of course I'm dealing with people who grew up in that corridor, and I hear it almost every week. The only real problems in this business are on the coast, in California and between Boston and Washington or Boston and Richmond, and whatever's out there we don't think has a problem. Part of it is a perception. It's big, and two things there. Number one, the scenario that I painted before is as accurate in the Midwest as it is anywhere else. The urban areas, large and small, have all aggregated around the best agricultural land, and they continue to grow. There is also a misperception that because you don't have very high population growth, that you don't have land development and wasteful land development patterns. I've got some statistics there, recent ones. The Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission, just within the last 6 months, over this fight over the new third major airport in the Chicago area, has released some statistics. In the last, since 1970, between 70 and 90, the population of the Chicago metro area grew by 4%. The built-up land area increased by 65%. Detroit, I just got statistics the other day, in the same period of time, the Detroit metro area population grew by 6%, the built-up land area increased by 45%. I'll tell you what I really think, that these programs started in New England and Maryland. Pennsylvania is a new program, California is a new program. They're bellwether states. You could fit Massachusetts and Connecticut into 2 or 3 Indiana or Illinois counties for the most part. All of the farmland in both of those states is less than most counties in these states. The perception of the problem was driven. The population densities are so great that the techniques were thought up and tested quickly there. That's where the most mature programs are. To get it passed in Pennsylvania was a tough sell. So watch it passed in North Carolina was a tough sell politically. So I think what's happened is that you had techniques that are relatively new. These are things that have only been going on for 10 years anyway, that were designed and implemented initially by necessity. They were sort of trench tested, the bugs worked out in the smaller states that are still states in every sense of the word except that they're tiny. And then they've begun to be exported. Pennsylvania's program passed in 1989. California is a cost-sharing program. This is a state bond referendum that provides direct cost share to counties, but that was only in 1990. So we're talking about these things just breaking out of the New England states recently, and I think you are going to see. If we can do it in North Carolina, I think you're going to see it start to pop up in the Midwest. There's a couple counties in Illinois, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, and Michigan, townships in Michigan that are already looking at revenue sources. And then I think the next step you'll see is some kind of a state cost-sharing program. Be a voluntary program at the local level, and the state will come up with some kind of matching money. It's just a matter of time. Okay? Well, thank you all for your attention. I'm really glad to be here. And you got a question in the back? I missed the middle of your question. Can you come on up a little bit? My read on it is that it was just part of the structure of agriculture. That farms in the Midwest were different operations. More than 10 or 15 years ago, I told somebody at lunch today, 25 years ago doesn't seem long to me, but it probably seems long to most of you. The structure of agriculture was different. You had more animals. You had to have woodlots in the summertime to provide shade for your animals. It just gets too hot. Some people used it for firewood and lumber and fence posts, but mainly that was the issue. Since you had animals on the farm, they had to have a cool spot to hang out in the summertime. If you had a slope, you could, instead of putting it into row crops, you could leave it in pasture or you could put it in hay. You understood the erosion problem. Two things happened after Nixon's trip to China and the Soviet Union. One, grain prices took off. If you can remember back to the mid-'70s, there was a phrase on the Chicago Board of Trade that said, beans in the teens. And people did crazy things. It was like a gold rush. And on top of that, they were told, literally, to tear out the hedges and tear out the fences, and the animals in that case started to go west. They went into feedlots in Nebraska and Colorado and Kansas. Hogs went into confinement sheds. So you took the animals off the land. You lost the utility of a lot of these ground covers. And frankly, you had an old soil bank program. And a lot of the incentive programs that the federal government used to offer to maintain these systems just were wiped out. And the notion was that you'll make so much money that you can go back and afford to take care of the land. What happened was, when crop prices went up, Canada came in, Argentina came in, Australia came in, production went up so high that prices crashed, and that's what led into that farm crisis in the 1980s, and nobody could afford to do anything. So it's not so much that we didn't know the value of proper land use, as that we just lost sight of it for a while, got into a situation where the water quality problems got so bad, and then found ourselves working our way out over the last 10 years or so. So I think to some extent we are relearning the value of these things, but we knew. It was just a matter of greed, really, and a presumption that nobody could compete with us in agriculture. Yes, sir. You have to stand up and move up a little bit. I think we need to get some animals back, number one. That'll give you some diversity right there. It'll give you a need for pasture, it'll give you a need for hay. But if you remember the one note that I put on here under state programs, I think we've got to get some diversity back. There are states that are doing it. Texas, under their former Secretary of Ag, a fellow named Jim Hightower, just went out and did it on his own and developed not just new products, but markets for those products. Very, very profitable farming opportunities. Florida takes their economic development program. I mentioned Illinois and Kentucky going after auto factories. Florida spends their money in agriculture, both promoting and marketing citrus, a whole new series of tropical fruits and vegetables. Massachusetts does a good job, Vermont does a good job, Wisconsin does a reasonably good job. I think that's one of the roles of the state governments. The federal government simply won't do it. But because of the number of jobs, the economic opportunity that's there, and the value of these programs, that's where I would look for the states to get involved in assisting farmers. Farmers, in a lot of cases, don't have the knowledge or the expertise to do the market development and the product research, but they can produce it. So through the land grant system, through the state government, through the state agencies, I think those kind of development assistance programs go hand in hand with a land conservation program. And if you can show, I'm living in Virginia right now, and the Virginia Tech is working on artichokes, cabbages, and broccoli. They've got the right varieties identified, how closely you can grow them, how far apart the spacing in the rows have to be. What they're trying to do is replace tobacco. Tobacco is a lucrative crop, and they know that unless they can go out with an alternative crop, there's no way tobacco farmers are going to give up tobacco. But they've developed a whole handful of new fresh market vegetables. They're also working on transporting them right back into the Baltimore, Washington area. So they'll help them develop the product, and then they'll help them find a way to get it to market, and then I think you'll see a willingness to switch over. And so if the states get in that way, I think you'll see a real diversity and a more focus on producing food rather than feed. But it's going to have to be a parallel but separate effort. Yes, sir.
Along with the conservation focus of your group, it sounds like you're also advocating for the structuring of agriculture into a more sustainable model. Is that right?
You guys got those questions I was going to write on these 3x5 cards out there. We're actually doing some work in sustainable ag, in part because the establishment wasn't doing it. Our perception was that there's a new generation out in agriculture right now, and this is based on a lot of survey research we've done over time. Initially on this notion of conservation compliance. When I went to DC, the prevailing wisdom was that there is no way on earth that you can tell these farmers they have to do conservation or they can't get their farm payments. You could never link these two. They won't stand for it. We went out and did survey research in Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Colorado, and Tennessee, and anywhere between 60% and 90% of farmers said not only should you link conservation and farm program benefits, but they should have done it 35 years ago. You can really poke some holes in this notion of this conventional notion of what's going on. But USDA, and I hope there's nobody here from the land grant system, I don't want to offend anybody, but frankly the land grant schools had gotten wired into the agriculture industry and the establishment, and were unwilling to really get out and experiment, not so much with alternative methods, but certainly not with sustainable methods and environmentally sound methods. So what we did as an experiment in Illinois, because I'm from there and the fellow that was running our Midwest office at the time was from there, we got a group of farmers together and started something called the Illinois Sustainable Agriculture Association, and offered them a chance to do demonstration plots, 20-acre side-by-side comparisons with their conventional fields. And we started a nonprofit group. It was run by the farmers. We just provided technical support for them and helped structure these demonstrations. First year we had 12 farmers. And as Jim said, I was born at the University of Chicago and grew up on the inner city, literally in the inner city. So I'm not an agronomist by any means, but these guys are. We let them design their own trials. We stood by, made a report, and then published it. My measure of success the first year was that all 12 of them said they wanted to do it again the next year. Right now we've got about 200 farmers cooperating in Indiana. We've got an Indiana Sustainable Agriculture Association. We've got about 15 demonstrations in Indiana this year, Michigan, Illinois, and Missouri. And essentially what they're doing is going anywhere from cutting their nitrogen in half to eliminating all pesticides, herbicides, going back to green manure and animal manure for fertilizers. And our findings now over the last 4 years are that in most cases they can reduce their costs by as much as 30% without affecting their yields adversely. And the other thing we did in some survey research is ask them, where did you find out how much chemicals to use and how much to apply? On the order of 70% of them got most of their information from dealers. So the very person that sold you your inputs was the one who told you how much to use. And somehow that didn't square very well. So it's less than, I have to pull out my business card. We've got our mission statement on the back here. It says, we work to stop the loss of productive farmland, and promote farming practices that lead to a healthy environment. I don't have a mission to change the structure of agriculture. If people on big farms want to farm in an environmentally sound way, that's fine with me. We do have some evidence that suggests that it's a lot easier to do that on a somewhat smaller unit. And if you can lower your costs without lowering your yields, you can sustain yourself on a smaller farm unit. So you're beginning to chip away at the incentive. And remember, that's what I was talking about. This open-ended reward for production at any cost also leads to an incentive for farms to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So I'm not on a crusade to wreck the emerging structure of agriculture, which is bigger farms and fewer farmers, but I am operating on the assumption that people on the land are there because they want to be there. And that if we can show them a way that their business can be more profitable, that they can avoid draconian regulations designed to protect water quality by doing proper land use and cultivation practices, and if these sustainable methods work, I suspect the structure of agriculture will change itself. So, but we're in there, and nobody else was doing it. The Rodale organization was out there, but they're got a much stronger emphasis on organic practices, and they're much more rigid. We took the farmers, literally corn and bean guys from the Midwest, and said, you design your own demonstration and come back and tell us what it is. Half of them cut out all their nitrogen entirely. And some of them had yields increase in a year where they put in no purchased nitrogen at all. Just fascinating stuff.
Our city has a 4-lane road that connects it to the interstate highway about 8 miles long. And the road is lined with beautiful Indiana farmland, and every patch of which has a sales line on it as it goes from the city westward. Very simple thing that you can say that you could sort of think about doing that would stop that phenomenon, or that might be some risk, that kind of condition.
it isn't simple. I'm a big fan of having a local organization, whether that's a land trust, and it may be, particularly in university towns, you tend to have people who are willing to get involved and read and understand what's going on elsewhere in a conservation movement. Soil and water conservation districts can do it, but frankly, in most of the country, they're not ripe yet. Yeah, I don't want to mislead you. There's nothing easy about it, but I would start with some kind of a local conservation group. Either there's one that exists that's got multiple purposes, or you need to start thinking about a land trust organization to do two things. One, to take information like a group like us puts out and make it available to landowners. Secondly, somebody's got to hold these easements. Let's say you've got two, in fact, we went by a couple today. You've got this model airplane association group that's bought a big chunk of ground, and apparently, at least outwardly, they're suggesting that they want to conserve it. Well, there's a perfect first case. Why don't you guys show us the strength of your convictions, be a good neighbor for the community, put an easement over that ground, and give it to the, whatever the name of your land trust emerges to be. There's your first easement. What we've done in the bluegrass in Kentucky is work with an existing group and find where they've got agricultural districts in that state. We've begun to work around the agricultural districts and try to put together blocks of land under easement. We're working on a 4,000 acre preserve there right now. So that's step one. Easements are legal in this state. You can go that far, but you've got a long way to go. You don't have the policy backdrop, the kind of state protection policy. You don't have agricultural districts in this state yet, and I suspect you're a ways away at any rate from some kind of a purchase.